Aaron had always been a man who prized routine. From his disciplined morning workouts to his evenings spent unwinding with a good book or a late-night sports game, everything had its place. His job at the marketing firm was demanding, but it was rewarding. Head put in the hours, earned the respect of his colleagues, and enjoyed a steady rise through the ranks. His personal life, too, seemed to be on the path he had always dreamed of. He had found Emily, someone who matched him in ambition and drive, and they had been together for 3 years. In his mind, their future was already written: marriage, a house in the suburbs, maybe a dog, and children a few years after that. A simple life, built on mutual trust, love, and shared goals. But lately, the picture had begun to blur. Aaron first noticed the shift in Emily's behavior about a month ago, but it was easy to dismiss at first. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible. Emily, usually so communicative, had begun to withdraw. She was still there, still physically present, but emotionally, it was as though a wall had quietly risen between them. The late-night texts she used to send him, the small surprises, the deep talks, they had all started to fade. At first, Aaron told himself it was just stress. Emily had recently been promoted at her own job, and with the added responsibilities, she had less time for their usual rituals. It was normal, he reasoned, for her to be more focused on work. But over time, the gaps between them widened. The little things began to stick out more. The way she would retreat into her phone every time he entered the room, the slight coolness in her voice when he called her name, how she began staying out later after work, sometimes not even letting him know. Aaron had tried to confront her once. It was after a particularly cold dinner when they barely spoke a word to each other. He had asked her how her day was, and instead of the usual excitement that accompanied her recounting of her day, she merely mumbled, "It was fine." She hadn't even looked at him while saying it. Later that evening, when they were in bed, Aaron asked, "Are you okay, Em? You've seemed distant lately." She had just shrugged, her back turned to him as she lay on her side. "I'm just tired, Aaron. It's nothing." The words came out flat, and her tone didn't match the comforting embrace he was hoping for. Aaron tried to let it go, convincing himself it was just a phase. Everyone went through it, right? But his gut told him something was off. Why can't I shake this feeling? One night, after work, Aaron decided to surprise Emily with her favorite takeout, hoping it would lift her spirits. He called her as he was on his way home. She answered quickly, but there was an odd hesitation in her voice, one he didn't quite understand. "Hey babe, I got your favorite Chinese food. Are you home yet?" he asked, trying to sound upbeat. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before she answered. "I'm not there yet. I'm going to be a little late tonight," she said, her voice strained but still calm. Aaron frowned, not for the first time realizing that her absence had become more frequent. She had started staying out later, telling him work was piling up, or that she was meeting friends, but he'd never been able to shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. "Everything okay?" Aaron asked, his voice a little more careful this time. He could hear the faintest rustle in the background, but he couldn't tell if it was her walking around or something else. "Yeah, it's fine," she said quickly, too quickly. "I'll see you later. Okay? I have to go." The line went dead before he could respond. That night, he sat alone at their kitchen table, the food still warm but untouched. The silence in the apartment was deafening. He had already tried calling her twice more, but she hadn't picked up. He tried to push the rising panic away, chalking it up to her being busy. She had been working long hours lately, after all. But the pit in his stomach wouldn't go away. After a while, Emily came through the door. She was wearing the same clothes she'd left in hours earlier, her face flushed but not from exercise. From something else, something he couldn't put his finger on. She didn't smile when she saw him. Instead, her eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Hey," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sorry about earlier. I had a last-minute thing." Aaron stood up from the table, his brow furrowing. "You could have told me. I was worried. We were supposed to have dinner together." She nodded but didn't meet his gaze. "I know. I'm sorry." She hesitated, looking at the food he had set aside. "I ate out. I wasn't hungry." Aaron's stomach twisted. Something about the way she said it felt rehearsed, like she was trying too hard to convince him. The feeling that had been building up in him for weeks was starting to feel like a weight he couldn't ignore any longer. "I don't get it, Emily," he said, his voice softer now. "What's going on? You're not the same lately." For a moment, she looked at him, her face unreadable. Then she looked away, as if the words had become too heavy for her to carry. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, her voice quieter now, almost defensive. Aaron felt his frustration mounting. She wasn't even trying to explain. "I don't understand. We're supposed to be a team. Why are you pushing me away?" Emily's eyes flicked briefly toward the door, and for a second, Aaron wondered if she was about to leave again. Instead, she just turned away from him and walked into their bedroom, closing the door behind her. He stood there, frozen. The words he wanted to say, the questions that filled his mind, were lost in the growing silence. The man who had always been able to trust, who had believed in the future they were building together, stood there, feeling more alone than he had ever felt in his life. He didn't know it yet, but this would be the first moment where everything began to fall apart. The crack in their relationship had begun, small at first, but it was only a matter of time before it would shatter everything he had built. That night, Aaron didn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking of all the things he hadn't said, all the things he hadn't seen. The quiet that had once felt like peace now felt like a suffocating weight, and the life he had always thought he could count on was suddenly out of reach. The storm was coming, and it was going to change everything. Over the next few days, Aaron's unease only deepened. Emily's behavior was more erratic. She would get quiet when he entered the room, or when he asked about her day, she would offer short, clipped answers. The air between them felt thick, charged with something unsaid, something dark. One night, as he sat at his desk working late, he heard the familiar sound of Emily's voice. She was on the phone, her words muffled by the closed door. Aaron, distracted by his thoughts, didn't pay much attention at first. But then, a single sentence caught his ear. "I'll be there soon. Don't worry about her." The words sent a chill down Aaron's spine. He had heard Emily say plenty of things on the phone, but something about the way she said that made his blood run cold. The mention of her, who was her, and what was Emily doing that she didn't want him to know about? Aaron's heart began to race. He had always trusted Emily implicitly, but now, as the words echoed in his mind, doubt began to settle in. He stood up from his desk, his breath shallow, and approached the bedroom door, trying to quiet his footsteps. He needed to hear more. He pressed his ear against the door, straining to catch the rest of the conversation. Emily's voice had softened, almost too soft. "Just keep it between us, okay?" she said, the words making Aaron's stomach churn. "We'll figure everything out." Aaron stepped back from the door, his mind spinning. The pieces didn't fit. The woman he loved, the woman he had planned a life with, was hiding something from him. He didn't know what it was, but he was certain it was something far more serious than a simple lie. The days after their conversation felt like an endless blur. Aaron tried to go about his usual routine, throwing himself into his work to keep his mind from unraveling. But no matter how many reports he analyzed, how many meetings he attended, his mind kept drifting back to Emily. He couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong between them. Every time he walked through the door, expecting the warmth and comfort of their shared home, he was met with a cool, almost indifferent atmosphere. Emily had become a ghost in their relationship. She was there physically, but emotionally, she was slipping further and further away from him. The distance between them, once imperceptible, was now a chasm he couldn't ignore. One evening, Aaron came home to an unusually quiet apartment. Emily's car was in the driveway, but there were no sounds of her usual hustle. No music playing, no sound of the TV in the living room. He felt his stomach tighten as he stepped inside. The apartment was dimly lit, and there, on the couch, Emily sat alone, her phone in her hand. She didn't look up when he entered. He tried to keep his voice steady. "Hey, you're home early." She glanced up at him but didn't smile. "Yeah, I wasn't feeling great." A small lump formed in Aaron's throat. He wasn't sure what bothered him more. The fact that she was lying or that she couldn't even muster the energy to pretend anymore. He stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of her silence press against him. He needed answers. He needed to know why everything had changed, why the woman he loved seemed so distant, so foreign. He began, his voice quieter than usual. We need to talk. This isn't working. What's going on? She didn't answer right away, just stared at her phone screen, her fingers scrolling absent-mindedly. Aaron's heart raced. This was the moment he had dreaded for weeks. Finally, she set the phone down and sighed, her face drawn and tired. She leaned back into the couch, avoiding his eyes. I don't know what you want me to say, Aaron. His patience snapped, and he took a step closer, his frustration bubbling over. I want the truth, Emily. Why are you pulling away from me? What happened to us? Her shoulders tensed, and she rubbed her temples, as though trying to ward off a headache. It's not you, okay? It's me. That's what she had been saying for weeks now. It's not you. It's me. A phrase that never failed to make Aaron's blood boil, because it felt like an empty excuse. She had said it before, but never like this, never with such a hollow tone, as if she were trying to convince herself rather than him. I'm not stupid, Emily, Aaron said, his voice sharp with disbelief. You've been acting like you don't even care. If there's something going on, just tell me. Emily's gaze flickered briefly to him, then back to the floor. She seemed to shrink under the weight of his words. Aaron stood frozen, staring at her, waiting for something, anything, that would explain why everything felt so wrong. She exhaled slowly, her lips pressed tight, and then, almost as if the words had been building up for far too long, they finally came spilling out. I've been seeing someone else. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Aaron's heart stopped. His thoughts scattered like broken glass. The words echoed in his mind, repeating over and over like a mantra he couldn't escape. She's been seeing someone else. He blinked, trying to process the weight of her confession. What? His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, as if speaking louder would shatter the fragile reality he had built for himself. What do you mean, Emily? How long has this been going on? She swallowed hard, her eyes welling with tears, but there was no relief in them. Only guilt, shame, and something else Aaron couldn't quite place. She didn't answer him directly. Instead, she just nodded, as though it were an inevitability that had been written in the stars. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice small. It just did. Aaron felt as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. It just did. Her words were a knife in his chest. He had spent so many years building this life with her, and now, with one sentence, she had destroyed it all. There was no anger in his heart yet, just this hollow emptiness, a quiet devastation that he hadn't known could exist. He stared at her for a long time, not sure what to say. It was as though his mind couldn't catch up to his feelings, couldn't process the magnitude of her betrayal. You've been seeing someone else, and you didn't think I'd notice? He finally asked, the bitterness in his voice betraying the calm facade he was desperately trying to maintain. I didn't want to hurt you, she whispered, looking up at him, her eyes desperate for understanding. I thought I could fix everything. I thought if I could, I don't know, maybe if I could just ignore it, it would go away. Aaron shook his head slowly, the weight of it all sinking in. And you thought this was something I could ignore too? Her silence spoke volumes. She didn't know what to say to him, didn't know how to fix what had been broken long before the affair had even started. Who is he? Aaron asked quietly, though the question felt almost irrelevant now. He needed to know, needed to see the face of the man who had stolen her from him. But at the same time, he didn't want to know. He didn't want any more of this. I'm sorry, she said, the tears finally spilling over. I didn't want it to end like this. I didn't want to hurt you, but I don't know how to fix it now. I don't know how to fix what I've broken. Aaron took a step back, his chest heavy, suffocating with the weight of the truth. He had spent so long ignoring the small signs, the moments of doubt that had built up inside him. But this was something he couldn't ignore, something he couldn't fix. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Aaron couldn't look at her anymore. Not the way he had, with hope in his eyes, with the belief that everything they'd built was unbreakable. It wasn't unbreakable. It was shattered, like the pieces of glass that had been scattered across the floor, impossible to put back together. I don't know what to say anymore, he finally whispered. I don't either, Emily said, her voice small and barely audible. The space between them felt infinite now. And no matter how much he wanted to reach out to her, to somehow piece together the broken pieces of their relationship, he knew he couldn't. Not anymore, because trust, once broken, was impossible to repair. I think you should leave, Aaron said, his voice barely a whisper, as if the words had to be dragged from the depths of his chest. Emily nodded silently and stood, not looking at him as she gathered her things, moving as if she were already a stranger in his life. As she walked out of the door, Aaron stood frozen, alone in the silence. Everything he had once known, everything he had believed in, was now in ruins. The woman he loved, the woman he had shared his dreams with, had betrayed him, and now he had to figure out how to live in a world without her. But as he stood there, numb and broken, one thought burned through his mind. How did it come to this? He didn't have an answer yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't the same man anymore. Days passed, and the tension between Aaron and Emily grew unbearable. The house, once a place of comfort, felt like a prison. Aaron could barely stand to look at her, could barely bring himself to speak to her. Every conversation felt like a battle, every glance like a betrayal. He couldn't understand how things had gotten so bad, how the woman he loved had become someone else. And yet, every time he tried to confront her, she deflected, offering more empty promises and excuses. One night, after another tense dinner where the silence had become deafening, Aaron could take it no longer. He stood up from the table and walked out the door, not knowing where he was going, just needing to escape. He ended up walking for miles, the cool night air biting at his skin, but nothing could numb the pain inside. His mind raced with thoughts of Emily. Why? How could she do this to me? He came to a stop in front of a park bench, his mind filled with nothing but confusion and hurt. There, alone in the darkness, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of the situation. Emily had taken everything, his trust, his love, his future, and torn it apart. It wasn't until weeks later that Aaron finally came to a decision. The pain of betrayal was still fresh, still raw, but he had begun to understand something important. He couldn't let this woman, this relationship, define the rest of his life. He had spent so long trying to fix something that was beyond repair, hoping that love could heal everything. But sometimes, love wasn't enough. He knew that leaving Emily wasn't going to be easy, that it would hurt. But the alternative, staying in a relationship that was suffocating him, was far worse. The next day, Aaron packed his things and left their apartment. The decision was final. He couldn't continue living in the shadow of someone who had betrayed him so completely. As he walked out of the door, he didn't feel relief, but he did feel something new, a sense of empowerment. He didn't know what his future held, but he knew that he would never allow someone else's betrayal to control his happiness again. The pain would eventually fade, and in time he would rebuild. But for now, he was free. And that freedom, though painful, was a step toward healing. Epilogue. The lesson Aaron spent the months following his breakup focused on his career, rediscovering his passions, and building a life that was his own. He didn't rush into another relationship. Instead, he focused on understanding what had gone wrong and learning from his mistakes. He realized that love, no matter how deep, could never fix the things that were broken beyond repair. And more importantly, he learned that self-respect was the foundation of any healthy relationship. Sometimes the hardest part isn't walking away, it's knowing when it's time to leave. The lesson stayed with him, and in the end, it was a lesson that set him free.